July 2nd, 1889, opened at 98 degrees by noon and smelled like hot iron and wet sage, though no rain had fallen in Cottonwood Crossing for 11 days. Heat shimmered over the wagon ruts until the road looked like spilled mercury, and above the town, a widow stood on her roofline with a brass spyglass pressed to one eye, measuring cloud bellies against the Sangre ridges, as if she were taking inventory of a war. Heather Harmon could tell by the wind's edge that the mountains were holding water. She could taste it, metallic and raw, before it ever showed itself as rain. Down in town, men in sweat-dark hats leaned under the saloon awning and watched her through cigar smoke. "There she is," one called. "Widow with trenches, counting ghosts again." Laughter carried up the slope. Heather lowered the spyglass and wiped the lens with the corner of her apron. Her cabin sat on a shelf of hardpan above Cottonwood Crossing. Sod roof weighted with stone, walls chinked against winter and dust, and a dozen shallow ditches radiating downslope like ribs. Two of those ditches fed a buried cistern. One diverted sheet runoff from the draw. One split around the root cellar hatch and joined a spill channel lined with river rock she had hauled herself in spring. From the valley floor, it looked like madness scratched into dirt. From above, it looked like survival. She turned as thunder muttered beyond the ridges and stepped back inside. The cabin smelled of beans, lamp oil, and lye soap. On the table lay a ledger full of columns in her careful hand. Flour remaining, salt pork weight, dried apples in crocks, nails by size, lamp wicks, lamp oil, medicinal spirits. Along one wall, 3 50-gallon barrels stood on cedar blocks beneath a patched gutter she had fashioned from flattened kerosene tins and pine pitch. The middle barrel leaked a spoonful an hour. She had wrapped the seam in waxed cloth and wire until she could afford proper pitch from the mercantile. Everything in her house had a purpose and a number attached to it. Grief had taught her arithmetic she never wanted. 2 winters earlier, Jacob Harmon had ridden east with a late cattle drive, hired as a drover by men who answered to Silas Creed. A blue norther came down out of nowhere near Fort Sumner. 4 men returned. Jacob did not. No body, no horse, no saddle, no witness worth believing. Blizzard took him, they said. Bad luck. After 6 weeks, the preacher told Heather to accept God's will. After 8, the county clerk told her she could apply to have him presumed dead once the legal interval passed. After 10, the town stopped looking at the road whenever hoofbeats sounded. Heather did not stop looking. She stopped depending. She had not learned preparedness from books or preachers, but from her mother, Annie Crow, who had crossed Kansas in a wagon and buried 2 babies before she was 30. Annie had taught her daughter that disaster announced itself in little ways first. The sudden hush in cottonwoods before a downburst. The angle ants built their mounds. The smell of clay when an arroyo would cut loose at night. Annie taught her how to stack stones to break current, how to raise grain above floodline, how to pack flour in sealed tins with bay ash to keep weevils down, how to mark a route to high ground with lime, so even children could follow it in darkness. Luck is lazy people's word, Annie used to say, tapping a weathered finger against Heather's forehead. Pay attention, then work. After Jacob vanished, Heather did exactly that. She traded his spare saddle and one of her wedding silver spoons for 6 used barrels from the rail camp at Cirillo's, 50 cents each, cracked staves and old molasses, stink included. She paid a Navajo tinsmith 75 cents to salt her gutters from scrap sheet and another 20 for rivets. She bought 12 sacks of lime at 10 cents apiece to mark evacuation lines from the churchyard to Mesa Verde Rise, where bedrock held and flood couldn't scour. She paid 2 schoolboys a nickel each to help her trench, 18 inches deep, 2 feet wide, 140 yards from her north boundary to the Spill Gully. She logged every inch in her ledger because numbers made fear behave. The first time she offered to help neighbors dig drainage swales around their homes, Mrs. Pritchard from the dress shop laughed in her face and said she would not have her porch defaced like a military earthwork. A week later, when a summer storm sent water through Pritchard's kitchen, Heather came anyway with a shovel and a bundle of sandbags stitched from feed sacks. "Don't expect thanks," Pritchard muttered. "Didn't bring a bucket for it," Heather replied and kept shoveling. Her reputation traveled faster than her work. By spring of '89, boys sang a rhyme when she passed. Widow Harmon digs for rain, burying spoons and hoarding grain. Ranch hands from Creed's spread called her Fort Heather. Some men smiled kindly and told her she'd be happier if she remarried. Others said less kind things. All of them trusted Silas Creed more than they trusted a woman with calculations. Creed owned nearly everything worth owning from Cottonwood Crossing to Dry Coyote Wash, 10,000 head by his own brag, though likely fewer. The stockyards, the largest windmill, the note on the livery, and 3 town council votes purchased in whiskey and wages. His foreman, Eben Pike, was a raw-boned man with pale eyes and a scar down his cheek, who could appear in any doorway without sound. Sheriff Hollis played cards in Creed's office twice a week. The judge took beef on account. When Creed said water rights belonged to those who could put them to productive use, deeds shifted, fences moved overnight, and men who protested found their wells fouled with dead coyotes. Heather had watched all of it and kept her head down. She could not fight Creed with shovels and jarred peaches, but she could make sure no storm turned town into a graveyard, while men argued over ownership of clouds. That morning she saddled her mule Juniper and rode down to the schoolhouse with a coil of rope, a handbell, and a plank she had painted with black letters. Flood route, follow Lime to Mesa. Miss Talley, the schoolteacher, met her on the steps with chalk on her cuffs. "Mrs. Harmon, if this is another drill," "It is," Heather said, "and this one needs to happen before Sunday. Parents are already angry. They say you frighten the little ones." Heather handed over the handbell. "Then let them be frightened in daylight while they can still see where to run." Inside, 15 children sat sweating on benches while flies stitched lazy circles in the rafters. Heather drew a rough map on the slate. Church, livery, smithy, creek, wash, mesa. She marked each with X's and arrows. She told them where to go if bells rang 3 times fast and 3 times slow. She made them repeat it until the smallest child, little Nora with one shoe, could shout, "Leave wagons, leave trunks, climb now." From the school she rode to St. Bridget's, where Father Doyle was replacing a cracked window pane with wagon glass. "I'll ring for funerals and fire," he said, not looking at her. "Not every dark cloud." "Then ring for water," Heather answered, "because if it comes at midnight, funerals will follow anyhow." He sighed and set down the putty knife. "You truly think it that bad this season?" She glanced toward the mountains. Cloud towers stood there like anvil heads, too high and too still. "I think upstream arroyos are running early. I think the stock dam Mr. Creed built in March is packed too fast. Seep lines are showing under the east face." Father Doyle frowned. "You've been on his land?" "I've been where floodwater will travel, Father. It doesn't ask permission." By supper, she had spent the last of her ready cash at Hodge's Mercantile. 8 pounds of salt at 6 cents a pound, 2 coils of lampwick, 1 keg of nails, mixed sizes, $1.10, a roll of canvas remnants for shelter tarps, 80 cents. Hodge wrapped the salt and leaned closer. "You keep buying like siege is coming," he said. "Folks are talking." "Folks always talk," Heather said. "Different now. Creed heard you telling people his dam's unsafe." Then he heard right. Hodge's eyes slid toward the street. "Careful," Mrs. Harmon. He don't mind being called cruel. He minds being called careless. By dusk, she was back on her slope, pounding stakes for an elevated grain loft behind the cabin. The posts were rough cottonwood, 6 by 6, cut to 9 feet. She sank them 3 feet and rammed caliche around each with an iron bar until the ground rang. Floor joists went on top, pegged notched into place, high enough to keep sacks above any reasonable floodline and out of rats' teeth. She worked by lantern until her shoulders shook, then sat on the step and ate cold beans from a tin cup, while lightning flickered silent beyond the peaks. She thought of Jacob as she often did at that hour, not the missing man swallowed by rumor, but the one who used to whistle while mending tack, who said rain on a sod roof sounded like applause. She still had his silver watch chain in memory, if not in hand, the way it flashed when he checked time by lamplight. Some nights she could nearly hear him pushing through the door, boots muddy, voice sheepish about being late. Some nights she hated herself for still listening. Near midnight, with the wind turning sharp from the northeast, Juniper stamped in the lean-to and gave one low, uneasy bray. Heather set down her awl and reached for the shotgun, out of habit more than intent. Hoofbeats clattered up the rocky track, then stopped hard just beyond her yard. Mrs. Harmon, a voice cracked in the dark, young and ragged. Please, please don't send me away. She lifted the lantern and stepped to the threshold. A boy stood swaying by the gate, shirt torn, face bloodied along one cheekbone, wrists raw as if from rope. He could not have been more than 16. She recognized him a second later. Luis Ortega, stable boy from Ramirez livery, thin as a rail and usually quick with a grin. Tonight he looked hunted straight through. Inside, she said. He stumbled over the sill. She barred the door, set the shotgun aside, and guided him to the chair. Up close she saw dried blood in his hair, one eye swelling shut, and mud ground into his knees. They're coming, he whispered. Sheriff, Creed's riders, all of them. I didn't steal nothing, ma'am. I swear on my mother, I didn't. Breathe first, Heather said, handing him waters. Talk second. He drank too fast, coughed, then gripped the cup like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Creed said 2 yearlings missing from his north pasture. Said I sold 'em over county line. Sheriff took me this afternoon. No hearing, nothing. They were going to hang me at sunrise, in front of everybody. Heather felt the room narrow. How did you get out? Cell window had rotten frame. I kicked till it split. Cut myself climbing. He held up, shaking hands. I ran through the wash, hid in cane till dark. Why frame you? Luis swallowed. His voice dropped to a rasp. Because I saw where they put them. Put who? The missing men. Mr. Talbot from South Fork. The Cardenas brothers. Maybe more. He glanced at the shuttered window as if expecting someone to look through. Out by Dry Coyote Wash, near the bent cottonwood and the basalt tooth, I was watering horses 2 weeks ago. Came around the draw, seen Pike and 2 riders with shovels at night. They had a wagon with canvas rolls. One roll had a hand come out when they lifted it. The lantern hissed. Heather heard her own pulse in her ears. Luis bent, fingers fumbling at the heel of his right boot. He pried loose a thin leather panel she hadn't noticed and pulled out a folded scrap of paper stiff with sweat and dirt. I wrote what I remembered, he said. Landmarks. Dates, I heard them say. I didn't know who to tell. Tonight in jail, deputy said. Hang the little thief quick before he starts stories about graves. His good eye met hers. Your husband's name is on there, ma'am. Jacob Harmon. Night he disappeared. For a long moment, Heather could not move. Thunder rolled closer, no longer distant. She took the paper with both hands as carefully as if it might break open and spill his bones right onto her table. The scrap held a crude map in charcoal, dry coyote wash, a hooked bend, a rock outcrop shaped like a tooth. Beside it, scrawled dates and names. Talbot, Cardenas, unknown deputy badge, and one line that made her vision blur. January 14th, blizzard night. G.H. chain took by Pike. Outside, somewhere down in town, a dog began barking and did not stop. Another answered. Hoofbeats echoed faint on the lower road. More than one rider moving fast. Heather folded the map once, then again, and tucked it inside her bodice. "Listen to me, Luis," she said, voice steady by force. "You are not leaving this house tonight. Not for anything short of fire. Do you understand?" He nodded, teeth chattering though the air was warm. She stood, crossed to the back room, and lifted the smokehouse trap key from its nail. Below the curing racks was a crawl space she had dug last autumn for cool storage, 4 feet high, dry, invisible once the hatch was shut. It would hold one frightened boy and a blanket. Before she moved, she paused at the table and looked once toward the dark silhouette of the mountains through the window. Stormlight pulsed behind them, white and vein-like. In town, men who trusted Silas Creed slept with their doors unbarred. By sunrise, she knew, there would be a bounty nailed to the post office wall with Luis Ortega's name and a price beside it, and anyone who sheltered him would be promised ruin. Heather moved fast. She took Luis through the back, lantern hooded, and unlatched the smokehouse hatch. Cool air rose from the crawlspace, smelling of ashwood and old salt. "Down," she whispered. "Mind the left side. There's a shelf peg." He lowered himself with a wince, one hand on his ribs. Heather passed him a folded army blanket, a canteen, and half a heel of bread wrapped in cloth. "If anyone comes inside, do not cough. Do not pray out loud. Do not move unless you hear me knock 3 times. Pause, then 1. Like this." She rapped the hatch frame. "Show me." From below came a shaky 3. Pause, 1. "Good." She hesitated, then added, "You did right coming here." His face, pale in lantern light, looked too young to carry gallows fear. "Will they hang me anyway?" "Not if I can help it." She shut him in, slid the curing racks back over the hatch, and scattered a handful of mesquite chips to hide fresh scuff marks. Hoofbeats sounded again below her slope. Closer now, several riders climbing, tack jingling sharp in the dark. Heather blew out the lantern, stood by the table with the shotgun across her forearms, and counted breaths. The riders stopped at her lower fence. "Mrs. Harmon," a man called, Deputy Kells by the nasal twang. "You seen a Mexican boy come this way?" "No," she answered through the door. "I've seen moonlight and moths. That all?" A second voice, Eben Pike's, flat as a shovel blade. "Open up. We'll look." "On whose warrant?" Silence, then Kells again, less sure. "Sheriff says escaped prisoner, rustling charge. Then sheriff can come with paper at daylight." Pike spat. She heard it hit dry dirt. "You're standing against law now, widow." "I'm standing in my own doorway." For a moment she thought he might kick the door in anyway. Instead, reins creaked. A horse snorted. "If he's in there," Pike said, "you're burying yourself with him." The hoofbeats receded slowly like a promise. Heather didn't sleep. She cleaned Luis's blood from the chair legs before dawn, boiled willow bark tea for his pain, and stitched a tear in the smokehouse blanket by lamplight while first light slid gray over the mesa. At sunup, a hammer rang from town, sharp, official, repeated. She knew that sound. Notices going up. By 8, a boy came panting up her slope with a broadside in hand, hoping for a nickel. Bounty, Luis Ortega, escaped prisoner, horse thief, $25 for return, dead or alive. Yeah, signed Sheriff Hollis. Below that, in smaller ink, any person harboring said, fugitive shall be subject to fine, confiscation, and jail. Heather read it once, folded it, and used it to level a wobbling table leg. By noon, she had begun adding to what the town mocked as her private fortress. She laid out 3 new trench runs from her upper catchment toward the Spill Gully, each at a gentler slope than before, 1-inch drop for every 8 feet, enough to move water without eating the banks. She cut sawed bricks and stacked them on outer lips for reinforcement. At each intersection, she drove willow stakes and wove brush between them to make check baffles that would slow debris. She lined the sharpest bends with flat shale so a surge wouldn't undercut in first contact. Every task got marked in the ledger. July 3rd, North Diversion Extension, 64 yards, 18-inch depth. Brush check baffles, 11 lime sacks opened. 2, wrote touch-up to Chapel Bend. Barrel patch wax used. 3/4 tin, jerky packed in oilcloth bundles. 9. She worked the way some people prayed. Regular, repetitive, no expectation of praise. Near dusk, she went into town with Juniper pulling the small flatbed and bought what she could still afford. 2 broken wagon tongues for timbers, 1 crate of chipped mason jars, and a coil of baling wire. At Ramirez Livery, she asked old Mateo, who had known Luis since infancy, if he had spare grain sacks. Mateo glanced toward the sheriff's office before answering. "I got sacks," he muttered. "I don't got bravery. I'm buying sacks, not testimony." He handed over 12 and refused payment anyway, pressing them into her wagon as if the cloth itself might be incriminating. Back at the cabin, she filled 6 sacks with sand and caliche for quick barriers, 6 with dried beans and cornmeal for relocation stores. She built a raised rack under the porch for firewood, cross-stacked with 2-inch airflow gaps, and tarped it against rain that had not yet arrived. She packed medical tins, bandages boiled and dried, tincture of iodine, laudanum counted drop by drop, splints cut from fence pickets. When she could steal an hour, she went to the smokehouse, knocked the signal, and helped Luis stretch cramped legs. He ate little, asked often for news, and tried to apologize every time she brought food. "Stop saying sorry," she told him on the second night. "Save breath. I'm making trouble for you. Trouble found me before you did." On the morning of the 4th, she saddled Juniper before sunrise, tucked the map scrap inside her corset seam, and rode east to the rail camp where the circuit judge was hearing land cases out of a freight office. She left Louis hidden with strict instructions and both barrels filled beside the hatch. The rail camp smelled of creosote ties and coal smoke. Men in suspenders queued on the porch with deed packets under their arms. Heather waited 90 minutes in dust and heat before a clerk let her inside. Judge Merriweather sat behind a scarred desk, coat off, sweat dark under his arms. He peered at Heather over spectacles. "Mrs. Harmon, you've no claim filed." "I have evidence of murder and false accusation," she said, laying the folded map on his blotter, "and a boy being hunted to cover it." Before he could open the paper, the door behind her clicked. Eben Pike stepped in without knocking, hat in hand, smile thin. "Beg pardon, Your Honor. Sheriff asked me to deliver stock tax receipts." He set a leather folder down, then looked at Heather as if noticing her by accident. "Didn't know we were entertaining rumors now." Judge Merriweather's fingers hovered over the map, then withdrew. "Mrs. Harmon, serious allegations require sworn deposition, corroborating witness, and proper docket. I cannot issue warrants on notations." "He'll be dead by docket," Heather said. Pike leaned against the jamb. "Escaped thieves tend to run hard, ma'am. Sometimes they run right into bad luck." She faced the judge. "Set hearing today." "Impossible." "Court calendar." "Today." Merriweather stiffened. Mind yourself. I can hear petition Tuesday next. Tuesday, she repeated, hearing the word like dirt on a coffin lid. Pike's pale eyes held hers as she gathered the map. Widows who dig in ranch business, he said mildly, usually find their gardens trampled. She rode home with her jaw clenched so tight it hurt. By then, Cottonwood Crossing had decided what story it preferred. At Hodges Mercantile, conversation stopped when Heather entered. Mrs. Pritchard, choosing calico at the counter, turned her back without pretense. Two ranch hands by the flour bins spoke loudly enough to carry. Some folks hide thieves, then preach preparedness. Maybe she's collecting boys now, like barrels. Laughter mean and easy. Hodge weighed out her order. Pitch, lamp oil, coffee, then named a price nearly double last week's. That's not your posted rate, Heather said. Supply trouble, he muttered, eyes down. You sold Pike sugar this morning at Standard. He shrugged in a way that meant Creed's name without saying it. Heather set exact coins on the counter anyway, and left with her parcels tied tight. Outside, 3 boys chalked Thief's aunt on her wagon side and ran before she could catch them. She wiped it off with spit and a rag, climbed up, and drove on. At St. Bridget's, Father Doyle intercepted her before she reached the bell rope. You can't just ring whenever you please. Then schedule drill tonight. People are upset. Sheriff says your warnings interfere with lawful pursuit. My warnings keep children from drowning. He pressed thumb and forefinger to his eyes. Heather, if you are hiding that boy, surrender him. Let the court decide. The court postponed murder until Tuesday. That is an accusation. That is arithmetic. He had no reply to that, only a tired blessing she did not ask for. Organized cruelty followed where open argument failed. The feed store refused to sell her oats on instruction. Someone cut the lashings on her wagon tarp at night. A dead rabbit appeared nailed to her gatepost, belly slit, with a note in charcoal, "Dig here." On Sunday, Sheriff Hollis read the bounty aloud after service and added, voice ringing over the congregation, anyone aiding this fugitive stands against law-abiding citizens and against property rights of every honest rancher in this valley. Heads turned toward Heather in one motion as if choreographed. She stood through the whole speech without flinching, then walked out before the final hymn. On the church steps, little Nora from school slipped her a wildflower and whispered, I remember the bell pattern, Ms. Harmon. 3 fast, 3 slow. Heather tucked the flower into her ledger. She adapted. If church wouldn't host drills, she ran them from her own slope at dusk, using 2 lantern boys she paid in peach preserves. She repainted the lime route where wagon wheels had scuffed it out, adding arrows at every blind corner. She staked rope guides in the steepest section up Mesa Verde Rise so elders could haul themselves in mud. She cached supplies there under oiled canvas weighted with stone. 3 water barrels, hardtack tins, blankets, a box of tinder sealed in wax. When people laughed, she marked another route. When people cursed, she filled another jar. When people refused to help, she wrote their names in no column at all and kept going. One afternoon, while she measured ditch depth by yardstick, a stone clacked off her roof. Then another. She turned to see 2 older boys on the road below, grinning with slings. Hey, Fort Heather, one shouted. Rain's scared of you. She lifted the shotgun, not aimed, just visible, and laid it across the porch rail. The boys vanished like quail. By the 6th of July, even Miss Tally, usually kind, would not meet her eye in public. Parents threatened to pull children, she said quietly when Heather asked for another school drill. I'm sorry. Then teach them in spelling. Miss Tally blinked. What? Floodmesarun. A reluctant smile twitched at the teacher's mouth before fear smothered it. "You're a difficult woman, Mrs. Harmon." "I'm a living one." The weather turned stranger. At dawn on the 7th, Heather walked the upper draw and found dampness where there should have been powder dust, a thin seep bleeding from packed soil, carrying fine silt in milky threads. She knelt, touched it, rubbed grit between fingers. Fresh movement, not spring water. She rode farther east to where Creed's stock dam crossed a tributary notch. Built in March, it was an earthen wall 20 feet high at center, faced with clay and brush, rushed together by hired crews before thaw fully settled. From below, it looked solid enough to impress men who never studied water. Up close, Heather saw the flaws like rot in a tooth. The downstream face had a dark, wet stripe 3 yards long near the right abutment. Toe ground was soft under hoof. Ant columns had shifted uphill to rebuild mounds on higher knolls. Cottonwood leaves showed their pale undersides all morning, flipped by gusts that came in hot bursts, then died, dead still. Overhead, thunderheads built vertically and did not travel, feeding on themselves. She dismounted and drove her knife into the dam face. Clay peeled in a slab, too slick, too unconsolidated. Whoever compacted this had done it dry in layers too thick, then skinned it with wet mud for appearance. If cloudburst hit the catchment hard, hydrostatic pressure would punch through that seep line like a thumb through bread. On her ride back, she crossed Arroyo Delgado and saw trickles already running from a storm that had fallen only in distant high country. It was noon. The channel should have been bone dry till late monsoon. She stopped at the blacksmith and told him, "Move your coal and tools to loft level tonight." He wiped sweat from his beard. "Sky's clear." "Upstream isn't," he snorted. "You hear voices in mud now?" At council that evening, 3 men in shirt sleeves under the hotel awning, Creed among them in a white hat. Heather laid out what she'd seen. Seep on east face, early arroyo flow. "We need controlled release from the dam and night watch on Bell." Creed smiled as if indulging a child. "My engineers inspected that dam." "You don't have engineers." "I have men who build." "Men who build fast for wages, yes." Murmurs. One councilman coughed to hide a laugh. Creed stepped closer, cologne and cattle both on him. "Folks are tired of your panic commerce, Mrs. Harmon. Every storm season you sell fear and sacks. I give sacks away. Then maybe you profit in attention." She held his gaze. "If that wall fails at night, your attention won't keep a child breathing." Sheriff Hollis moved between them, palm out. "Enough. Council finds no immediate hazard. Meeting adjourned." As she turned to leave, Creed said softly, "Only for her. You keep talking and I'll see that cabin auctioned under harboring law. Might even plant what I need to do it." Heather did not answer. She had learned long ago that some threats were bargaining. Others were weather. This one felt like weather. Twilight came with a copper cast to the sky. Swallows flew low, skimming inches above ground, snatching insects driven down by pressure. Juniper refused her feed and kept lifting her head toward the north, ears rigid. In the smokehouse, Luis whispered through the hatch, "Is it tonight?" "Soon," Heather said. After dark, she walked her lines one more time with a shuttered lantern. At the west ditch, she found fresh boot prints and a section of cut bank where someone had kicked in her diversion wall. Deliberate. 2 yards torn open so water would rush toward her cellar instead of around it. She set her jaw, fetched shovel and sacks, and rebuilt by moonlight, ramming caliche until her palms blistered open. Halfway through, the first thunder rolled, not mountain mutter now, but close enough to shake the shovel handle in her grip. Heather straightened and looked toward Cottonwood Crossing. Lamps glowed warm in unbarred windows. Laughter drifted up from the saloon. No one was moving wagons. No one was climbing to mesa ground. No church bell rang. She drove the final stake, tied it off with wire, and whispered into the wind, to Jacob, to God, to no one at all. I can't carry them if they won't stand. Then she picked up the lantern and went to wake the town anyway. She made it halfway down the slope before the wind changed hard enough to stagger her. At 10:06 p.m. on July 7th, the air was still 84 degrees and close as wet wool. By the time Heather reached the churchyard gate at 10:19, the gust front had slammed through from the northeast, dropping the temperature 12 degrees in minutes and lifting dust in a brown wall that blotted out the moon. Cottonwoods bent and held, leaves turned white side up like fish bellies. She pounded on St. Bridget's side door with the heel of her hand. "Father Doyle!" No answer. She pounded again. At last he opened in shirt sleeves, candle in one hand, hair flattened on one side from sleep. "You can hear it now," Heather said. "Ring." He looked past her to the dark ridgeline, and whatever he saw there changed his face. He didn't argue. He handed her the candle, turned and climbed for the bell loft. The first bell strike cracked through town at 10:24. The second came before echoes died. Then he found the pattern she drilled into children and no one else. 3 fast, 3 slow, 3 fast. Doors opened all along Main Street. Men stepped out cursing at the dust. Women pulled shawls tight over nightgowns. Somebody shouted, "Fire where?" And somebody else shouted back, "Ain't no fire, it's that widow again." Then lightning tore the sky from ridge to ridge, not a fork but a sheet, and thunder hit so close the hotel windows rattled in their frames. A second later, rain came. Not drops, not a shower, but a hard, slanting roar like gravel poured from wagons. In less than 10 minutes, boardwalks ran black and slick. In 20, every roof spout in Cottonwood Crossing was throwing a solid stream. In 30, the little side channels that usually soaked and vanished were overtopping into the road. Heather ran door to door with her lantern hood open despite the wind. "Up to mesa ground. Leave trunks. Move now." She grabbed wrists, shoved shoulders, repeated herself until her throat burned. Some followed, many did not. At the hotel awning, Silas Creed stood with 3 of his riders, dry under canvas, white hat untouched by rain. "You're causing panic," he called over the storm. She didn't slow. "Your east face is failing. My dam's held every storm this season. This isn't every storm." He took one step toward her, jaw hard. "You ring bells on my name again and—" A rider galloped into the street from the north road, horse lathered and blowing. The man nearly fell dismounting. "Mr. Creed," he yelled. "Upper corrals are gone. Fence line ripped out. We lost near 200 head in the draw. More running south." Creed's head snapped toward him. "What?" "Water came over the cut bank like a wall. Took the yearling pens first. Branded stock and prize calves both." For the first time since she had known him, Heather saw uncertainty on Silas Creed's face. Just a flicker, gone almost at once beneath anger. He pointed at Heather as if she had summoned the sky herself. "Get out of my road." She did. Not for him, for the woman behind him trying to wrestle 2 crying children into oilskins. By 11:03 p.m., rain had fallen 43 minutes without a break. Later, they would measure nearly 3 inches in that first hour at town level, and more than double that in the mountain catchments. At 11:11, Arroyo Delgado jumped its banks. At 11:17, the first wagon on Lower Main floated 2 feet sideways and wedged against the smithy hitch post. Heather cut down the alley behind Hodges and nearly collided with Miss Tally, the schoolteacher, hair loose and plastered to her cheeks, arms full of slate boxes. "Leave those!" Heather shouted. "They're attendance records," Miss Tally gasped. birth dates, guardians. Paper won't breathe water. Children do. Another thunderclap struck so close they both ducked. A section of adobe chimney from the abandoned print shed, softened by rain, gave way with a wet cracking sound and slammed down across the alley mouth. Mud brick exploded into shards. One chunk struck Miss Tally high on the temple and she dropped without a sound, slate boxes skittering into brown water. Heather went to her knees in the runoff. Lena, look at me." Blood thinned pink in the rain and ran between board seams. Miss Tally's eyes fluttered once and fixed somewhere past Heather's shoulder. There was no time for sorrow and no place to put it. Heather dragged the body by the shoulders out of the current and into the lee of a stone wall, pulled her own shawl over the teacher's face, and stood because screams were rising from the livery. Ramirez Livery's lower stalls were already knee-deep. Horses shrieked and kicked at tie rails, eyes white in lantern flashes. Old Mateo Ramirez was inside with a knife, slashing halters as fast as his stiff fingers allowed. "Mateo, out!" Heather yelled from the door. "One more row!" he shouted back. "One more!" The back wall gave first, not all at once. First a bulge, then a split, then the whole plank section blowing inward under pressure from the yard outside. Water and fence posts and manure slurry punched through together. Mateo turned, slipped, and vanished under a surge of black water and thrashing hooves. Heather waded in 2 steps, reached, got a fistful of his shirt, lost it when a bay gelding slammed against her hip and spun her into a post. She hit hard, gulped muddy water, surfaced coughing. By then, Mateo was gone downstream under debris and horseflesh, and there was nothing human hands could do. She staggered out, one arm numb, and kept moving. Her lime route lasted longer than anyone expected, then began to disappear. At the chapel bend, wagon ruts churned the white marks into paste. At the creek crossing, her rope guide held for 10 minutes, then snapped when 4 men tried to drag a loaded trunk uphill instead of leaving it. One of her cached water barrels on Mesa Rise broke free when the canvas tie ripped and rolled 30 yards downslope, smashing open on basalt. Plans held until pressure found each weak stitch. Then plans became choices made in breath lengths. By 11:40, the town was no longer pretending this was a passing storm. People were on roofs. People were trapped in second-story rooms whose stairs had floated away. Men who laughed at trenches an hour earlier were clawing mud from door frames with bare hands to free jammed planks. Children screamed for mothers from dark windows. Cattle, mules, and chickens spun together in the same current through streets that had never seen more than ankle water. Somewhere to the north, a sound began, deep, continuous, wrong. Not thunder, not wind. A grinding roar with a pulse in it, like stone tearing. Heather knew that sound before anyone said it. The dam was going. The first true wall of floodwater did not hit town all at once. It hit in teeth. At 11:52 a.m., no, 11:52 p.m., she corrected later in her ledger with a shaking hand. The leading surge came down Dry Coyote's feeder channel and punched through Creed's stockyard fence line. Posts snapped like matchsticks. Branded tack, feed troughs, and half a bunkhouse porch went tumbling in churned foam. Men who drew wages from Creed's ranch ran beside the current shouting numbers of lost cattle, like numbers could hold anything in place. Then a second surge, taller, carrying timber. Heather had 6 families on Mesa Rise by then. The Moraleses, 2 widowed sisters from the laundry, Hodge's wife and youngest, Blacksmith Trammell's mother wrapped in blankets, and 3 children nobody could account for yet, including Tommy. She sent the older boys back down the marked road in pairs with lanterns, strict orders to take hands and not belongings. One came back alone, sobbing so hard he hiccuped. Tommy got pulled from me by the post office," he said. I had him. I had him, but we got split in the rush. I lost him behind a wagon and couldn't see if he made a porch or roof. Tommy Hodge was 8 and had ears that stuck out and a habit of whistling through his front teeth while he swept the mercantile floor. Heather had taught him to tie clove hitches in spring because he begged to help with rope guides. She did not ask for more than landmarks and direction. In this water, children vanished from sight in one blink and turned up 2 houses over in the next, if they found height and luck. Below, Deputy Kells and 2 others tried to force open the jail transport shed where prisoners were usually moved before court days. Water had reached the steps. Kells waved for help, boots braced wide, rope around his waist. Heather started toward him, but before she reached the corner, a wagon box came around the bend broadside and clipped the group full force. One man went clear over the hitch rail. Kells held one post for a second, face shocked. Then the post tore out at ground level, and all 3 vanished into the dark run between hotel and smithy. Names were becoming objects, then absences. Suffering multiplied by simple things people had refused to do earlier. No packed bundles by doors, no agreed meeting points, no elevated food stores, no rope lines preset, no one assigned to elders, no bell watchers rotating in shifts. Families split in minutes and had no plan to find one another except shouting over wind. Heather's preparations did not stop the storm. They made narrow corridors through it. Where limes still showed, people moved faster. Where sacks had already been staged at doorways, they bought minutes before water breached rooms. Her root cellar held dry potatoes and salt pork while other pantries dissolved into silt. Her elevated grain loft stood above the first inundation while feed sheds in town collapsed. On Mesa Rise, her cached blankets meant children stopped shaking hard enough to seize. In the flats below, people wrapped babies in wet coats and prayed until their teeth clattered. Near midnight, she fought back down to her cabin for more lamp oil and to bring Luis up before the lower track became impassable. The back door stood half open. Inside, the chair was overturned, table shoved aside, flour tracked across the floor in boot prints she did not recognize. The smokehouse racks had been dragged away from the hatch. The hatch itself hung crooked on one hinge. A smear of blood marked the frame where someone had been hauled out fast. "Luis," she shouted once, though she knew. No answer but rain drumming the roof. On the table lay the Bounty broadside she had used as a shim, now weighted with a deputy's brass button and a scrap of twine. No note, no warrant. Just the message in absence. They had come while she was in town and taken him. She closed her eyes for one breath. 2. Opened them and moved. She grabbed both remaining lantern tins, her pry bar, and the coil of baling wire. At the threshold, she stopped long enough to pull Jacob's old work gloves from their peg. When she stepped back into the storm, the north horizon flashed white and stayed white too long. Then came the true break. A concussive crack that rolled through ground and chest together, followed by a roar so loud it erased every separate voice below. Creed's dam had failed. Help came to her not as apology, but as panic. She had reached the lower church lane when a shape barreled out of the rain and nearly knocked her down. Eben Pike, hat gone, face streaked with mud and blood, left sleeve ripped to the elbow. In his arms he carried little Nora, the one-shoed schoolgirl, wrapped in a horse blanket, soaked, shivering and crying, but clinging hard to his collar. For a second, neither spoke. Weeks of threats stood between them, suddenly weightless against water. Pike thrust the child toward Heather. She was on a roof by Pritchard's, couldn't get her mother loose. His voice cracked on the last word, whether from cold or guilt she could not tell. "There's 30, maybe more, trapped at the ranch bunkhouse in the hotel loft. Creed's pinned somewhere in the stable, men say. Sheriff's missing. Bell rope snapped. We can't see the route. Heather took Nora, checked her quickly for bleeding and broken limbs, tucked the blanket tighter, and felt the girl's grip tighten back. Get her uphill to Mesa Rise. Put her with Mrs. Morales. Tell them warm stones at her feet, not fire on skin. Pike blinked at the orders, then nodded once. He did not move. Mrs. Harmon. The title sounded strange in his mouth now. Smaller. I said things, did things. I cut your ditch Tuesday night. He swallowed rain. If you help, I can't promise what happens after. Creed, I'm not bargaining with you. Heather shoved a lantern into his free hand. I'm telling you where to stand. She pointed through rain she'd memorized in daylight. Follow the line where you can still see it. Where you can't. Count 20 paces from the chapel fence, then angle left for the basalt outcrop. Keep one hand on rope if you find it. If it breaks, crawl. You hear me? Crawl. Send anyone you pass uphill, anyone. I don't care whose brand they ride for. Pike's mouth worked like he wanted to argue and had forgotten how. At last he said, Low. Jail's taking water. Ortega's inside. She turned her head sharply. Who locked him? Kells brought him in around 11. Said he found him hiding in your smoke shed. Pike looked away. Kells is gone now. Keys may be with him. For one heartbeat, Heather stood absolutely still while floodwater swirled around her boots. Then she handed Nora back to Pike long enough to tighten the lantern wick and tie her shawl over the child's head. Go, she said. And you? Heather looked toward the jail where water now slapped the second step and rose with every surge. I'm going for the living, she said, and started into the black water without waiting to see whether he followed. The jail door was swollen oak, banded in iron, and the padlock sat half under water, slick with silt. Heather jammed the pry bar through the staple and heaved. Nothing. She shifted her footing, braced one shoulder against the frame, and pulled again until the metal screamed. Behind the door, someone pounded back. Who's there? Luis's voice, hoarse and cracking. Please, please. It's me, she shouted, back from the door. She wrapped baling wire around the lock shackle, twisted with the bar for leverage, and felt the first give. A floating crate slammed into her calves, nearly taking her down. She planted again and yanked, teeth bared, until the shackle snapped and flew into the current. The door swung inward with the water pressure. Luis stumbled out, wrists tied, one side of his face bruised fresh purple. Another man cowered in the back cell, drunk from Saturday, barely conscious. Heather crossed, kicked his latch to, then sliced Luis's rope with her knife. Can you run? I can. He looked past her at the black water in the hallway. Where's Kells? Gone. She shoved a lantern into his hands. Listen. 3 fast, 3 slow if you hear bell. Follow Lime uphill. Take every child you see, and if an adult argues, leave them arguing and keep moving. He nodded once, hard. You? Hotel stable, then Mesa. They splashed out together. At the church corner, they split. Luis with 2 boys she grabbed by collars and set to lantern duty. Heather toward the hotel where the flood had turned Main Street into a brown, churning channel. By then, the stable wall had collapsed on the south side. A roof beam lay across 2 stalls, pinning a man beneath from shoulder to hip. White hat crushed flat in mud beside him. Silas Creed was conscious, teeth clenched, rain and blood running together down his temples. He saw Heather and spat mud. Don't just stand there. She knelt, checked the beam, checked the water climbing around his ribs. You can feel your legs? Some. Good. Means they're still attached. 2 ranch hands hovered uselessly, pulling at the wrong end. Heather barked, Stop yanking like fools. You'll twist him in half. She pointed. Trammell, Pike, over here. The blacksmith came first, chest heaving, Then Pike with Nora delivered and empty-armed. Luis arrived seconds later, soaked, dragging a fence rail. Creed stared when he saw the boy. Save it, Heather snapped. On my count. They wedged the fence rail under the beam as a lever, Trammell anchoring the fulcrum with a hitch post chunk. Heather crouched at Creed's shoulders. 3, she said. 2, 1, lift. The beam rose 3 inches. Pike shouted with strain. Luis slid his hands under Creed's coat and pulled while Heather dragged from the other side. Creed came free with a raw scream as the beam dropped back and splashed mud over all of them. Up, Heather told him. You can curse on high ground. She and Luis took an arm each and half carried, half dragged him into the current, then across to the chapel steps where volunteers were ferrying people uphill in batches along what remained of the route. By 1:10 a.m., Mesa Rise held more than 60 souls, shivering under tarps and wagon blankets, lit by 4 lanterns turned low to save oil. Children cried until they had no voice left. Elders coughed black water. One woman rocked an empty shawl where her baby should have been and would not let anyone touch her. Heather climbed onto an overturned trough and started issuing work as if she were assigning chores on a dry morning. Morales, fire pit 2, small, shielded with stone. No big flames in this wind. Mrs. Hodge, count children and say names out loud. If no answer, mark it. Luis, rope line from this post to that juniper so nobody wanders in dark. Pike, you and Trammell check ankles and wrists for breaks before swelling sets. If you don't know how, I'll show you. No one laughed at her now. She opened caches one by one. Hardtack tins, dried beans, salt pork strips, boiled bandages sealed in cloth, spare socks, lamp wicks. She handed out ration cups and made people drink in measured turns because panic gulping led to vomiting and dehydration just as surely as thirst. She set wet children between warm adults, taught them to breathe into blankets to trap heat, instructed boys to heat smooth stones near coals, and wrap them before placing at feet. At dawn's first gray, the contrast sat plain as scripture. Creed's grand stock dam was gone, its expensive earthwork turned into a gash in the hills and ruin in the valley. The hotel's imported wallpaper peeled in ribbons off broken walls. Lockboxes from the mercantile lay pried open by water, coins scattered in silt. Meanwhile, Heather's patched barrels, ugly, wire-bound, unromantic, still stood by her cabin with drinkable water. Her trenches, scarred but intact where she'd repaired sabotage, had split and slowed runoff enough that her root cellar remained dry. Modest things, done early and often, had outlived pride. When rain eased to a cold drizzle, Heather sent teams down by twos with rope and poles to pull survivors from rooftops and drift piles. They found 3 alive in the post office rafters, 1 with a broken arm. They found Deputy Kells against a cottonwood snag, dead. They found Mateo Ramirez in reeds below the ford, hat still tied to his belt by cord. And by full morning they found Dry Coyote Wash stripped naked. Where flood had scoured 20 years of brush and topsoil away, pale shapes lay exposed along the bend Luis had marked. Ribs, femurs, skulls canted in gravel, bits of rotted canvas, a deputy's badge green with age, saddle tack stamped with Creed's brand. A tin deed packet burst open, papers miraculously legible in parts beneath oilskin. Heather stood at the edge, boots sinking into wet sand, while Luis knelt and pulled something from a tangle of roots with shaking fingers. A silver watch chain, blackened but unmistakable. He placed it in her palm without speaking. She closed her fist around it until the links bit skin. By noon, a territorial marshal rode in from the rail line with 6 men and 2 wagons of medical supplies, drawn by telegraphed reports of dam failure and mass casualties. Marshal Adair was narrow-shouldered, hard-eyed, and did not remove his coat despite the mud. He listened while Heather, Luis, Trammell, and, After a long silence, Eben Pike gave statements under the church, awning turn triage station. Before taking final signatures, Adair filed a provisional notice that Sheriff Hollis, unaccounted for since the peak surge, was formally listed missing and presumed dead pending recovery, with a territorial inquest opened. Pike spoke staring at his own hands. Creed ordered pressure. On Talbot, Cardenas boys, others about water claims. Said make examples. He swallowed. I helped Barry. I did. Marshal Adair's pencil scratched steadily. Names. Dates. Locations. Pike gave them. Creed, on a cot with splinted leg and bandaged ribs, shouted from across the room. He lies to save his neck. Ortega stole from me, and that woman's been poisoning this town against lawful business for months. Adair did not look up. Mr. Creed, you can preserve your defense for court. He signed the arrest order on the spot for Silas Creed and Eben Pike. Murder, conspiracy, false accusation, and obstruction. He assigned 2 deputies from outside county to guard them, men Creed had not paid and could not charm. By evening, Cottonwood Crossing gathered in front of St. Bridget's because there was nowhere else large enough left standing. The bell rope had been spliced with wagon trace. Mud dried in cracks on everyone's boots and faces. They read the names of the dead first. Miss Talley, Mateo Ramirez, Deputy Kells. 17 others, with pauses where bodies were still missing. Then Father Doyle stepped down from the church steps and did something he had never done in public. He turned to Heather in front of everyone and bowed his head. I refused your drills, he said, voice carrying in the wet hush. I called your warnings disturbance. I was wrong. No one moved. Mrs. Pritchard, dressing torn to the knee, stepped forward next. I laughed at your trenches, she said, not looking up. My kitchen wall would have held if I'd cut the swale you offered. Hodge came with his hat in both hands. I charged you double because I was afraid of Creed. My boy's alive because your rope line was there when mine snapped. One by one, others spoke. The blacksmith, the laundry sisters, ranch hands whose bunkhouse survived only because Luis had led them up in darkness. Some cried as they apologized. Some sounded angry at themselves and called it anger at weather. A few could not speak at all, and just stood with wet eyes fixed on the ground. No one asked forgiveness with eloquence. They asked with ruined hands and empty sleeves and children alive beside them. When they were done, all eyes went to Heather. She stood in the same mud as everyone else, Jacob's chain in her pocket and Luis at her shoulder. For a moment she said nothing. Rain tapped soft on the patched bell. Finally, I don't need you to like me. A rough laugh escaped someone and died quickly. I needed you to listen before water reached your door, she went on. Now we've paid tuition. She looked over the crowd, stopping on each face that had mocked her and each one she had pulled from current. Hear me plain. We bury our dead with dignity. We feed every survivor, including men who worked Creed's herd, because hunger breeds more graves. We give statements to the marshal and let court hang guilt, not rope in a square. If anyone starts a mob, they answer to me first, and the law second. Creed barked a bitter laugh from his cot. You talk like you own this place. Heather turned toward him. No. I talk like I plan to keep it alive. She faced the town again. My stores are open. Not free for all. Organized. Mrs. Morales keeps ration list. Father Doyle marks medical needs. Luis and Trammell run hauling teams to the spring since lower wells are fouled. In exchange, every household sends one able body at dawn to berm work above Maine and one at dusk to debris clearing. No exceptions for money. No exemptions for grief. We grieve while we work. There was a murmur, then nods, then voices volunteering before she could assign. That night, by lantern light in her cabin, one of the few dry roofs left, Heather spread bread, beans, and jerky on the table for 12 people, including 2 of Creed's displaced riders. One hesitated in the doorway. "You sure?" he asked. "After all." She slid him a bowl. "Eat first. Explain yourself later." Between spoonfuls, she taught again. How to boil floodwater 3 rolling minutes at this altitude. How to bleach a well and test by smell. How to dig latrines downhill and downwind from camp. How to stack salvage lumber with spacers so it dried straight. The lessons moved from mouth to mouth, then hand to hand. Rescue became routine. Routine became rebuilding. 3 days later, some men wanted to drag Creed from his guard wagon and hang him from the cottonwood by the ford. They chose dusk when tempers sharpened and grief turned mean. Heather saw the knot of bodies forming before the shout went up. She crossed the square with a shovel still in hand from berm work and planted herself between mob and wagon tongue. "Move," one man snarled. His brother's name had been read at church. "No. He bought law for years. You think court won't sell him free again?" Marshal Adair's deputies were outnumbered, hands on sidearms but unwilling to fire into neighbors. The crowd surged a step. Heather lifted the shovel like a staff, not a weapon. "You hang him now. His lawyer calls it riot and says every confession got beaten out by fear. You want him dead, or you want him convicted." The man spat. "I want my brother back." "So do I," she said, and her voice broke for the first time since the storm. "I want Jacob back. I want Miss Tally and Mateo back. Flood doesn't return what it takes, and rope won't either. But court records do last. Verdicts do travel. If we do this lawful, no ranch king from here to Santa Fe can pretend he didn't know." The crowd wavered. Luis stepped up beside her, bruises yellowing now. "He framed me because he thought no one would listen to a stable boy," he said. "If you mob him, you prove him right. That truth don't matter. Only who shouts loudest." Silence held, ragged and breathing. Then Father Doyle rang the bell once. Not alarm. Gathering. People lowered fists. One by one, they stepped back from the wagon. The grieving man who had shouted first dropped his rope in the mud and walked away without another word. Creed was taken to territorial court alive. At the preliminary hearing in Las Vegas, Heather testified in a plain brown dress with calloused hands, folded steady on the rail. She gave dates, distances, seep lines, names. She did not embellish. She did not soften. She handed over Jacob's chain when asked, then took it back after identification with a formal receipt tucked into her ledger. When defense counsel suggested she had fabricated danger to attract attention, she answered, "If attention was what I wanted, I'd have chosen easier work than trenching caliche at noon." Laughter rippled. The judge banged for order and overruled the objection. Luis testified after her, voice thin at first, then firm as he unfolded the boot heel map and traced each landmark. The courtroom clerk entered his exoneration before noon. Rustling charge dismissed. False accusation acknowledged on record. Outside on courthouse steps, reporters asked Heather if she wanted hanging. "I want precedent," she said. "Hanging is one day. Precedent is years." Spring came cold and bright. On the first Saturday of April, town council met under a rebuilt awning, new posts, old scars, and passed 2 ordinances by unanimous vote with signatures in wet ink. 1. Seasonal preparedness drills at start of monsoon and first snow. Bell patterns standardized and taught in school. 2. Open water rights ledger maintained in public view, with claims, transfers, and disputes entered for all to inspect. The ledger sat on a chain stand in the mercantile, pages ruled by Miss Tally's former students. No claim moved quietly again. That same afternoon, Heather stood on Mesa Rise while children practiced the route with packs timed by pocket watch. Luis, now apprenticed to Surveyor Elkins from the rail camp, paced contour lines with a leveling rod and notebook, calling elevations for the new permanent flood berm. "Stake there," he told a crewman. "No, 2 feet left. Water curls at that bend." His confidence had deepened into something like calm. He still startled at loud knocks. He still slept with boots near bed. But when he looked at maps now, he looked like he was reading a language he intended to master. After drill, he climbed to Heather's porch and handed her a wrapped parcel. Inside lay Jacob's watch chain, clean but not over-polished, links repaired where flood grit had scored them. "Marshall released personal effects," Luis said. "I signed as witness." Heather ran the chain through her fingers, feeling weight, cold, history. "Thank you." He shifted, then grinned shyly. "Elkins says if I keep my figures straight, I can sit for territorial survey exam in 2 years. "Then keep them straight," she said. "Water doesn't care about bad math." He laughed, and the sound no longer carried fear. In June of 1892, a storm nearly as hard as the one that broke Creed's Dam rolled down from the Sangres at night. At 10:18, St. Bridget's bell rang 3 fast, 3 slow. By 10:26, families were already moving, lanterns hooded, bundles pre-packed, elders on carts assigned by roster, children calling out checkpoints like spelling words. Rope lines were in place before first overflow. The berm took the first surge and held. Water entered lower streets shin-deep, then drained through new spill channels without taking houses. No one drowned. Afterward, boys who had once sung Widow Harmon Digs for Rain competed to patch lime markings before breakfast. No one called her Fort Heather anymore except with affection. Years later, when rail made town larger and strangers asked why a bell tower had flood marks carved into its beams, old-timers pointed uphill to the sod-roofed cabin, rebuilt in timber now but still ringed with practical ditches, and said, "That's Harmon's line. We keep it because she made us." On an autumn morning in 1901, Heather, hair threaded silver, spyglass still bright from use, stood beside a group of new homesteaders near Dry Coyote Wash. Cottonwoods had regrown thick over the gravesite, and a fenced memorial stone listed names once buried in secret, Jacob's among them. She tapped the marker with gloved fingers and addressed the newcomers who shifted awkwardly in fresh boots. "You'll hear folks say disaster is bad luck," she said. "Some of it is. Most of it is neglect with good manners." A young woman raised her hand. "What if my husband says I'm overreacting?" Heather handed her a shovel. "Dig anyway." Laughter rolled warm across the wash. That evening, storm clouds stacked purple over the ridges. In town below, windows shuttered in practice sequence. Barrels were checked. Routes cleared. At first bell, people moved without argument, not because they were afraid of Heather Harmon, but because they had inherited her arithmetic. From her porch, she watched lanterns thread up the lime-white path toward high ground, steady as constellations. When thunder finally broke, no one mocked the widow with trenches. They followed her bell,